Hello, everybody. Hello, Professor. Hope my classmates are doing pretty good under these circumstances. That goes for you too, Professor. So, before I get into my topic, I would like to ask people if they ever had a female teacher, a high school sweetheart, any of those things, before I get into my topic. Or has anybody ever thought about Thomas Edison before they turned on the light? Maybe not, because it's not too big of a deal. But what is a very big deal is civil rights and how it pertains to us. Please forgive me for looking at my screen. It's the only way I can get my topic points and still be able to look at the camera. So I'm switching back and forth. So I'll have to adjust a little bit. So please bear with me. So, civil rights, female teachers, it ties in together. We don't think about that because it's just a part of our everyday life now. But it wasn't always like that. A lot of schools were dedicated to females, not intended for males and females to go to school together. So somebody had to fight for those civil rights. We take it for granted, but that's just one of the many civil rights people have been fighting for a long time. The most famous civil rights person, I would say, is Martin Luther King. Everybody knows his accomplishments as far as having multiple races going to school together. And that's very, very important. But it's kind of cliche now because it's just a part of our life. And we don't really take in consideration what it took to get there. So, Martin Luther King will never be forgotten. He's the only American to have a statue in Washington, D.C. That's not a president. That's very, very big. So we won't ever forget about him, but we don't take time to really think about how things got here. So away from every nationality going to school, if you ever been to a public school, understand that's also a civil right. It wasn't until, let me look at my notes, please, 1920 with the Smith-Towner Bill, according to the Concord Law Library. 1920 is when the federal government gave money for everybody to go to school. So let's think back. When this country was, when we did the Constitution, 1776, written by the founding fathers, penned by James Madison, the Constitution mentions right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, to name a few. But it doesn't say freedom to education. Everybody doesn't, they didn't think everybody deserved or needed equal education. So from 1776, 1920, I don't want to do the math, but for a very long time, nobody really thought about public schools. So that's a civil right. We take it for granted because everybody can go to school, but it wasn't always like that. So we shouldn't ignore the fact that people worked very hard, sacrificed a lot for everybody to go to school. All kids. Speaking of kids going to school, kids were also used as labor all through the 1900s. Very, very low wages, bad conditions. They'd had no civil rights. Children, all nationality, just children, no civil rights. It wasn't until the provisions made by the Department of Justice, Department of Labor, 1938, to they regulated some of these practices, okay? These child labor laws. We take it for granted now, but before 1938, a 10-year-old, 6-year-old can work 15 hours. Nobody cared. Well, somebody cared. That's why they fought for the civil rights of everybody's kids. Also, children were almost beaten to death by their parents. It was a complete ownership in the 50s, 60s, and, thousands of kids would be beaten by their parents. And the doctors had to come up with some type of way. So we had to make laws. And The law was passed in 1974 by Richard Nixon, out of all people. But Richard Nixon in 1974 passed the child abuse law, or the Child Abuse Act, made it against the law for parents or anybody to brutally beat a child. And these provisions still going on today. Even they change what is child abuse and what is not, because, you know, children had no civil rights. So we had to stand up for the children. Of course, they have their children. They need somebody to speak up for their civil rights. So civil rights is still a big deal, and it's not a thing that's basically going to ever go away. The world is going to evolve. We're going to have new social problems. Right now, what's a huge social problem is the homelessness and this coronavirus that we're all facing. So for years, we turned a blind eye to the homeless population. Now, overnight, the president of the United States orders every American citizen to go home, because the spread of the virus is only contained if everybody goes home. If we don't fix the homeless population, the rest of the society, the public, will always be infected. There's no way we can fix it. So now we have to look at the civil rights of the homeless people. For so long, like I mentioned, we turned a blind eye. We always point the finger to the homeless population and say, hey, you know, these guys are crazy, they're lazy, maybe on drugs, or whatever the situation is. So now it's a social problem. It's a big problem for everybody. And the civil rights are still being fought because these people can't stand up for themselves. They have no power, really. So now it affects the people that always pointed the finger. It's like, hey, you know, all of us as society, and somebody has to stand up for their civil rights now, because nobody will have civil rights if this virus isn't contained. So it's very important for us to look at civil rights. Sorry for having my eyes wandering everywhere, but I just looked at the time, and I saw a lot of topics I would like to cover, just don't have enough time to. So let me just remind you guys that every time you turn on a light switch, somebody was fighting for you to have that privilege. Every time you have a female instructor, anytime that you go to a public school, anytime you have a job that has a minimum wage, everybody has the cause and effect of civil rights. Thanks a lot for your time, and hopefully I will see you guys soon.